Important aspects of language, memory, attention, executive functioning are either not measured at all by IQ or poorly measured. Here are the things that are not measured by IQ tests: immediate and delayed verbal memory, immediate and delayed visual spatial memory, visual and auditory attention, planning ability, impulse control, cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift tasks. And here's something relevant for criminality and getting involved in crime: social reasoning, moral judgment, and empathy. None of this is measured by an IQ test.
Over 1 million Americans face sentencing every year, and it will be the most important day of their lives. But we don't fully understand the system, how broken it is, and what we can do to make it better. I'm Doug Passon. I'm a 25-year criminal defense lawyer and a sentencing expert. My goal is to bring more awareness, more fairness, and more humanity to the sentencing process. So, are you ready? Then let's get set for sentencing. Hey everybody, Doug Passon coming to you from Studio 3553 in Scottsdale, Arizona. Listen, our system is meant to honor the idea that when a person's conduct is the result of an intellectual disability or is connected to their intellectual disability, that they are less culpable than someone who does the same act who has a fully functioning brain. And in the capital world, the big case is Atkins v. Virginia, and it says that it's cruel and unusual punishment to execute someone with an intellectual disability. But Atkins misses the mark over and over and over again because it's using essentially a dull and antiquated formula to determine whether somebody qualifies as having an intellectual disability. And it's an evolving standard, and there's a lot of factors, but the overriding factor is IQ. And this is a problem. So today we're going to talk about whether IQ is always, sometimes, or never the valid measure of an intellectual impairment. And we're going to be talking about it in the context primarily of capital cases, but this is relevant to a lot of other areas and a lot of other contexts. And as you know, one of my areas of focus is autism defense. And I think this is deeply relevant to the question of how autism plays into culpability. So we're going to talk about that today too. And there is no better person to do that with than the incomparable Dr. Ted Lidsky, who's joining us today for Set for Sentencing. Hello, Dr. Lidsky. Welcome back. How are you?
Thank God, good. And you?
I'm okay. I'm okay. This is a lot. It's a lot to take in this whole thing, and I guess the whole world right now is a lot to take in. But we could talk about that some other day. Dr. Lidsky is a returning champion on Set for Sentencing. We had Dr. Lidsky on about a year ago, actually, and it's episode 81, and it's called A Child's Poison. And I want to put that link in the show notes too, because that was a really great episode. We did a deep dive into essentially lead poisoning and its effect on the brain and culpability. So Dr. Lidsky's resume is long. I'll make it short. He is a psychologist licensed in the state of New York. His specialty is behavioral neuroscience and neuropsychology. And his focus is on the effects of drugs and metals on the brain and behavior. And a major component of this work concerns the effects of lead on the developing nervous system. He's worked as an expert in criminal cases, including capital cases. So, like I said, we talked about lead last time, but this time we're going to do a deep dive into this area of IQ because Dr. Lidsky just had essentially a front row seat to the sort of deficiency in the analysis. He was involved in the case of a capital case in Indiana. The client was a gentleman by the name of Ben Ritchie. And I was wondering if we could just start there, Dr. Lidsky. Could you give me the lowdown on Mr. Ritchie's case?
Okay, Ben Ritchie. Oh, let me see. Get this thing to move. Okay. Ben Ritchie, as a young man, just about 20, killed a law enforcement officer. He was convicted in 2002 and executed just last May. Prenatally, he was exposed to alcohol and multiple drugs. He was confirmed to have fetal alcohol syndrome. He had lead poisoning during early development and had at least two concussions from blunt force head trauma, each one resulting in unconsciousness. He was convicted of capital murder, sentenced to death, and a Atkins appeal was turned down because it was based on their definition of intellectual disability, which is
And you know what? Can I jump in? Because
sure,
I don't mean to interrupt, but the story is always important, the narrative, and especially when we're talking about impulsivity and these types of things that the brain, the effect there. And so, just so people don't think this is some sort of very well planned out, premeditated crime with a lot of deliberation. This was essentially, from what I understand, he's with a buddy. They're in a stolen van. A police chase ensues. So they pull into a yard. They jump out of the van. They both run. One guy's caught by a police officer. Mr. Ritchie keeps going. An officer pursues and is chasing him down. And Mr. Ritchie, in the heat of that, draws a gun and fires and kills the officer. And for that, he sustained a death sentence way back in
exactly right.
it was like 1980, I think.
Yeah. So,
Probably back
uh,
during a time when we didn't know a whole lot about mitigation in general, and probably didn't know a whole lot about the brain science with all these deficits that you're going to be talking about.
and the other thing, the case was argued in 2002, and a lot more was known then. But they were basing their definition of intellectual disability on the definition of what used to be called mental retardation, which had
And we're talking
three
about the
factors.
Atkins case now, right?
Yeah,
We're talking about
right.
Atkins. And the
And why
reason
it
I
was turned
ask
down.
is, sorry, because we do this audio and video on YouTube. So some people, you've got a great PowerPoint up with a lot of these bullet points. And so I would encourage people, if you're listening to the audio, you may want to pop over to the YouTubes because there's a whole visual component to this podcast too. But so moving on, we're doing Atkins v. Virginia. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
So they based it on the definition of mental retardation from the American Psychiatric Association, which has three prongs. There's an onset before the development, during the developmental period. In other words, either well, in utero, or at least present at, during the first few years of after birth, a deficit in adaptive functioning, and the critical thing is a full scale IQ below 70, or at 70 or below 70. The Atkins decision, the Justice Stevens, who wrote for the majority, defined why people with IQs less than 70 or 70 or less have less culpability. He said basically, using the old term mental retardation, they frequently know the difference between right and wrong, and they're competent to stand trial, but because of their impairments, they have diminished capacities to understand and process information, to communicate, abstract from mistakes, learn from experience, deficits in logical reasoning, control impulses, so on. And there's an abundant evidence they act often act in impulse rather than pursuant to a premeditated plan. And then in group settings, they're followers rather than leaders. And their deficiencies don't warrant an exemption from criminal sanctions, but they do diminish their personal culpability. They also added to that because of their impairments, they really could not aid their counsel, uh, in the way that someone who was not impaired could do that. Plus, they made as a witness, they would tend to people might interpret their their whole demeanor as that the fact they weren't telling the truth, or they lacked feeling
Remorse and
guilt of what they
yeah,
did. They just want to
yeah,
make good witnesses for them. They couldn't defend themselves very well,
yeah,
all having to
yeah,
do with the deficiencies due to brain injury or brain damage. Ben
yeah.
Ritchie was given a neuropsych evaluation, and test results showed many of the same problems that somebody with of the sort that Justice Stevens described, poor impulse control, problems with logical reasoning, the whole gamut. His problem was that his IQ was 92. Didn't hit the criteria of being 70 or less. And the problem is that the court that looked at this, and I guess it's based on Atkins, doesn't understand that IQ is not a good measure of somebody's culpability. You can have an IQ in the so-called normal range or quite high IQ and still have deficits from brain dysfunction that would lead to you being essentially the same as someone with an IQ below 70. It's based on a number of misconceptions about IQ, which I've listed here. These are the major ones. First one is that IQ is a valid measure of cognitive functioning, and a low IQ is the is essentially the proxy for diminished cognitive functioning due to compromised brain function. Full scale IQ being a valid proxy for overall cognitive functioning. And if you have an IQ in the so-called average range, you should have average cognitive functioning. To get an accurate estimation of IQ, a person should be tested several times. That's something that's coming up in a case right now in Alabama. If you want to talk about that, we can talk about it.
Yeah, this is the one pending
Yeah,
cert and pending review in the Supreme Court, right? It's
yes,
the Hamm or the Smith case, yeah. But
right.
and they had like
That
five.
if you want to
I
get
think
an
they had like
accurate
five
measure
measurements,
yeah,
right?
of a person's real IQ, because IQ for any test, you never have optimal conditions. It could go up or down a few points. Person may not be feeling well. Person may not have got enough sleep. The something called the standard error of measurement allows an accurate estimation of a person's IQ, and I'll get into what that means in a little while. And finally, IQs above 70, especially those in the average range or even higher, cannot be found in individuals with brain injury that reduces culpability. So
All
I'm going
right.
to talk
So
about
these are five major misconceptions about IQ, and sadly, it seems like most of the current jurisprudence is resting on a foundation of misconceptions, very shaky foundation. So this is what we're going to dig into, but I also want to just put a fine point on it and circle back to autism because this is why I was super excited to have this conversation with you. I do some work in the capital arena, but most of mine is in non-capital. And even though Atkins shouldn't, isn't going to apply in the truest sense because it's talking about whether or not the ultimate punishment should be imposed, the rationale remains the same, which is to say they may know the difference between right and wrong. They may be competent, but at the end of the day, culpability is central to the determination of what is a fair sentence. And all of my autistic clients, all of them, I don't know that I've ever had a client who's below 70 IQ. Has always been much higher than that, sometimes exceptionally high. And that is the fundamental hurdle that we have in the autism cases where they look at the IQ, they've graduated high school, they have a job, they drive a car, these types of things, and they say, well, of course they knew what they're doing. You're just using this as some kind of red herring, some kind of excuse. And the truth is, their deficits have nothing to do with their intellectual functioning from this lifelong developmental disability. So all the same factors that Atkins raises in terms of impulsivity, inability to understand others, you name it, they all apply with full force to the autism cases. So my hope is that people are listening to this and they say, I don't do death work. I have these autism cases. Let me see how I can apply Atkins to that situation and Atkins and its progeny. And I will note that we just had the Kohlberger case, the serial killer in Idaho, and he was absolutely on the spectrum and extremely high IQ. And the lawyers did make a noble effort based on Atkins to try to get death off the table premised on his autism, and it went nowhere. But that's something I think even in the capital world, when we start to see more and more autism cases there, that lawyers need to keep working on that because it's real. So sorry I digress. Let's put you back on track. Where do we go from here? We just stated five misconceptions. What's next, doctor?
Let me explain what they are, but just to continue to what you were speaking about, I've had cases of people high functioning autism, which used to be called Asperger's,
Yeah,
cases with IQs above 130 who just could not function in the real world.
right.
And people, these were personal injury cases or medical malpractice cases. And it was very hard to get across to the jury that a person with an IQ of, say, 135, with a mean for the population is 100, has problems, has basically an invisible injury that
Yes.
can affect behavior. They look normal. They can even sound very articulate, and they just have impairments that
100%.
you cannot see.
That is our hurdle in every autism case, the invisibility aspect. So we're going to dig into the first misconception, which is that full scale IQ is a valid measure of diminished cognitive functioning due to compromised brain function. Why is this a misconception?
This is very straightforward. The problem is that IQ doesn't measure things that are critical, functions that are critical for normal behavior. It is a valid reflection, low IQ, when there's conditions are characterized by diffuse brain injury. For example, Down syndrome, profound autism. And I'm talking autism, so that's also accompanied with what used to be called mental retardation, very low IQ, injuries caused by asphyxia, ischemia, certain genetic disorders. All of these have very low IQ, and in those cases, IQ does reflect impaired cognitive functioning. However, in cases where the brain injury, brain impairment is more localized, such as fetal alcohol syndrome, lead poisoning, high functioning autism, it's quite different from low functioning,
Yeah.
traumatic brain injury, penetrating brain wounds, ischemia, stroke, where the injury is more localized. An IQ can be well above 70. It can be very actually quite high. And these people can be tremendously impaired. So they cannot function as a normal person would.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you an example of how this differs, how IQ does not always reflect brain injury. This is a paper that was published in 1999 by something DeLugos and others. There was a case of adolescents, mostly teenagers, who had epilepsy that was localized in the left temporal lobe, and it was intractable to medication. So what they did was basically they removed the left temporal lobe. The left temporal lobe is involved in speech. It's involved in certain types of memory, a lot of very basic functions. The graph, each one of these graphs, these pairs, shows verbal IQ, performance IQ, is before and after the lesion. And you can see for the first patient, the verbal IQ was fairly high before the temporal lobe lobectomy. It went down afterwards. Performance IQ was more or less the same. In contrast, the second patient, verbal IQ actually went up after the temporal lobe was removed, so did performance. And you see there's every possible
So,
combination. If you
wait,
look at them
we're
average
talking just
across,
sorry, we're just to get the lingo. We're talking when you say temporal lobectomy, are we talking about a lobotomy?
we're talking about a temporal lobotomy.
A
Let me
temp
just go ahead to this graph. This for I'll get to this graph later on, but just right
yeah.
now, it's like a side view of from the middle of the brain. This being the frontal lobe. Down here, all that's temporal lobe. The whole thing was removed. So I go get back. Uh, nope. I'm trying to figure out how to
That's
get.
that's kind of interesting. Why would somebody have a temporal
There you
lobectomy?
go. Okay. In this case, they had epilepsy localized to the left temporal lobe, but it's intractable.
Gotcha.
At any rate, after the average across all the patients, before the lobectomy, the verbal IQ was 101, 101.8. Afterwards, it went down just a couple of points.
Yeah.
Performance went up tremendously. And overall, the full scale IQ before was 101, after was 103.
Huh.
This is after a major portion of the brain was removed. And in fact, These people were impaired as a result of the injury, but the impairments were not something that was tested by IQ.
Could you give me an example of what the kind of impairments there were that didn't show up on the IQ
It would be
test?
problems in verbal memory. If you heard a story, could you remember it, say 5 minutes later? The kind of things you would see in the early stages of Alzheimer's, where people have where did I put my keys? Um, if you have that problem, don't get scared. It's normal later when you get older, but it gets to be pretty extreme in the early stages of Alzheimer's. Just to give you another example, this is from a study of Alzheimer's. This again is the side view from the middle of the human brain: frontal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, and parietal lobe. This is the so-called corpus callosum, where that interconnects two sides of the brain. In the early stages of Alzheimer's, it starts in the cortex overlying structures in the temporal lobe called the hippocampus, which is involved in memory, and the amygdala, which is involved in emotion, and also parts of the frontal lobe. In the early stages, maybe 20 years before you see symptoms, even though there is some damage, the IQ is normal and unaffected, and cognition is still normal. In the mild moderate stage of Alzheimer's, it is spread throughout the temporal lobe and also the structures underlying the cortex, the hippocampus and amygdala. It is spread further in the frontal lobes. And these are the people who now have problems with memory, problems with language, problems with word finding. Their IQ is still unchanged. Only when it gets to this stage, severe Alzheimer's with full-blown dementia, do you see a decrease in IQ. So even though you have damage in both of these stages, one, the early stage where there really is no change in cognition, but the moderate stage where there is a stage, excuse me, there is an impairment of cognition to the extent that it's difficult to function, these people's IQs are still the same, they haven't changed. This reflects the insensitivity of IQ to brain injury. And the reason for that, here, actually, the reason will be apparent in misconception number two, that full-scale IQs are a valid proxy for overall cognitive functioning. It's very simple that important aspects of language, memory, attention, executive functioning are either not measured at all by IQ or poorly measured. Here are the things that are not measured by IQ tests: immediate and delayed verbal memory, immediate and delayed visual spatial memory, visual and auditory attention, planning ability, impulse control, cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift tasks. And here's something relevant for criminality and getting involved in crime: social reasoning, moral judgment, and empathy. None of this is measured by an IQ test.
And I
And
would
that is
say,
why
and I'm thinking about again my autism cases, but this planning and impulse control and cognitive flexibility are three major factors. So they're on this list, but I think this is about executive functioning, right?
right,
And the plan and planning is so interesting because one of the big rationales in the Atkins line is deterrence. That it's not valuable for the goal of deterring behavior if you have these deficits where you can't think through the logical consequences of your action, or you have this
right.
inability to control an impulse. Cognitive flexibility is so key in the autism world because you get kind of stuck in this idea of this is how I solve this problem, and you can't get off of it and think about all these other things. So I think those the last six on that list are absolutely crucial to the concept of culpability in any case, in any case. So,
Interesting. All of these functions can be tested in objective testing, but they're not tested in a typical IQ test.
well, I hope at some point during this conversation we'll talk about some of the other, if IQ isn't going to reflect these crucial elements or measure a brain injury, the extent of the impairment, what should we be doing to quantify that and how? I may
Yeah,
be jumping ahead. We can get there later.
yeah, at the very end, I'll talk a little bit
Okay.
about that.
Okay, good.
All right, so the third misconception is that to get an accurate estimation of IQ, a person should be tested several times. So any kind of variations in its behavior, it gets sleep one time and another time, we give you a good measure of what his IQ really is. Problem is something called the practice effect. And it's due to two general things. One general problem is that the first time you go for an IQ test, everything's novel. You have no strategies for solving problems because you don't know what the problem is going to be. You might be nervous because you're being tested and your intelligence is being tested. When you test it the second time, then you probably have a different reaction based on your first. All the norms were based on someone who's taken the test once, not taken it before. People who come in where it's novel, they have no strategies, they, whatever emotional reaction they would have to be in that kind of situation, all is factored into the norms. That doesn't occur in the second testing. It's actually been studied. You can see this actually from the manuals, technical manuals with the IQ tests. Practice effect in when the interval is only 3 weeks. The full scale IQ will go up between 4 and 5 points. Uh, but the interesting thing is that 3 to 6 months, the practice effect for full scale IQ can be as high as 9 points. All right, that's still, we're talking about a relatively short interval. What is surprising is that there is actually a long interval effect, this actually surprised me when I first read across these papers. I'll just read them. This is verbatim from the papers. The references are cited below. On intelligence tests, substantial practice effects remain significant even with intervals of 7 years between successive assessments.
Hmm.
Two separate papers showed that. So if you have a situation, these papers they were looking at decrements in overall functioning due to aging. These were elderly people. And some of the decrements in aging were masked by the fact that they had practice effects which covered up what should have been a loss in IQ if it was a novel test. So this is the problem. And in the case in Alabama, the person was tested with the same general test, a Wechsler test, 4 times, and then Stanford Binet, which is a different one, but correlates somewhat, but it's a different test. So it's not, it's clear that this person go to that test, his IQ is in the so-called borderline range in the 70s, but beyond that, you can't say very much.
Right. And I
And
think the
actually,
government's
about
contention in that line of cases is that multiple tests enhance reliability. And you're saying
right,
that's
and
just flat out wrong.
that's the opposite.
Hmm. Okay.
And they did something else, which is interesting, which is something which is done quite often. Let's see, there's something called the standard error of measurement, and well, what basically is how if a person takes a test twice, how much variability are you going to get in it from time to time? People very often use a standard error of measurement to get an idea of what the range is of what the person's full IQ is. Let me get it's really getting in the weeds, but it's important.
Hmm.
The standard error of measurement is a statistic that tells you how much individual's observed test score is expected to vary from their true test score due to measurement error. It's always some error. Every test has some measurement error, but it reflects reliability. A highly reliable test have very small standard error of measurement. In other words, the scores are close to the true ability. A less reliable test will have a larger standard error of measurement. In short, the standard error of measurement gives a margin of error for individual test score. If you look at the effectiveness in IQ, with an IQ of 100, which is the average, the mean for the population, you can establish what are called the confidence intervals. Basically, how much confidence you have that the IQ score that you have would fall in a certain range. So, with an IQ of 100 and a standard error measurement of 3, which is really what a Wechsler test has, with a 68% confidence limits, the range would be for if a person scored at 100, it would be between 97 to 103. To go all the way up to 95% confidence limits, where you're rock solid, it's going to be somewhere in that range. It's 94 to 106. If you go to an IQ of 75, the ranges would be from 72 to 78, with 68% confidence limits, which is actually what most people use. At 95%, it's still 69 to 81.
Mm-hmm.
So it gives you some idea of how important the standard error of measurement is, and that
Wow.
that it be a small number.
Mm-hmm.
There's another statistic that people don't talk about, which is called the inter-rater reliability. That means if, say, you as a trained examiner and me as a trained examiner give the test, how close will we be on every item as far as as administration and scoring? It's important because it has an effect on the standard error of measurement. But with high inter-rater reliability, it means that the test results are objective and reproducible. With low inter-rater reliability, it means that the test results may be biased by who does the scoring.
Hmm.
But the inter-rater reliability has a direct effect on the standard error of measurement. To show it here, with a standard error of measurement of 3 and inter-rater reliability of 0.97. By the way, let me back. Perfect reliability would be a 1, 1.0.
Uh-huh.
Inter-rater reliability of 0.97 is very good, and that's basically what a Wechsler test shows. But why it shows that, I'll explain in a second. But at any rate, with that, if it just drops to zero point 0.9, which is still very good, the standard error of measurement almost doubles. If it goes to 0.85, which is still very good, it goes up to 6.7,
Hmm.
and it drops to 0.8, which is still fairly good, is 7.75, more than double. Now, the thing that's important to realize is that in the standardization period, where in the Wechsler they came up with an inter-rater reliability of 0.97, the examiners were very, very heavily trained because they wanted to get an absolute a perfect testing. So they had practice tests. They were observed by observers. There was video taken feedback. They would give multiple examples of problems, and finally, when they go through a long period of training, they'd give the test. The people who took the test were very carefully screened to screen out people who were sleepy, people who had taken drugs, people who had various emotional problems. So you get a perfect, a perfect, a perfect patient, a perfect examiner, and
Yeah.
that's what you're really supposed to do because you want to know what the test really, without any extraneous variables, what the test can do. In in clinical practice, you don't receive that type of training,
Right.
and the literature is that multiple errors are made by very experienced examiners giving IQ test routinely. So the inter-rater reliability will not be 0.97, it's going to drop. And what effect
How
that has,
um
I'm sorry, again,
well, and also in the clinical practice, your clients don't come to you in a pristine condition either. So it's on
absolutely
both sides, right? But how do you
right.
know? Like, how would I'm thinking my lawyer brain is thinking, okay, I have this IQ result, and I would love to cross-examine on these points to see what are the qualifications of the tester and what were the conditions on the ground of the testee. A lot of times these tests are decades old. You don't know. Nobody was there. Like, how do you even get to how do you peel back the layers of that to see whether the reliability is there? Or are we
It's
just going to
difficult.
some of the
Yeah,
literature that you're about to tell us?
yeah, yeah, I mean, that's I think it's basically an insoluble problem. I mean, you could ask how long a person's been doing that, whether they had any specific training, how many IQ tests they've given, but it's very difficult. I've seen people who are very experienced make really bonehead errors in giving IQ tests. I've seen situations. This happens fairly often where a person, uh, especially people in forensic work, will interview the patient, or in the case of his child, the parents, and then turn over the testing to a technician, and the person just leaves the room. Technician is not a PhD, is not an M, necessarily have masters,
Hmm.
may have been trained only you know by the psychologist himself rather than
Yeah.
they couldn't rigorous training. And it happens all the time. So
And nobody
it's
nobody ever like videotapes these testing sessions or anything, do they? I mean, would that be a possible mechanism to determine how
that
reliable?
that that would help a lot. There are
Yeah.
problems with the ethical code in doing that. There are all kinds of things you have to get all kinds of agreements and releases, but that would help a lot. I
Mm-hmm.
know for some cases, certain attorneys will demand to be in the room while the person is being tested.
Mm-hmm.
And there'll be the criticism that, well, you were a distraction or something else. But I've seen tremendous, I think it's been very helpful. They picked up in cases where you have vending machine psychologists, basically where you put in your money, you get out what you want.
Mm.
Things have been picked up that are striking, and it's only because the lawyer was there.
Wow.
I think it's probably a
All
good
right.
idea.
It probably is, and for down the road, because for example, in your Richie case, that was 1980. I don't know when his did he if he had IQ testing. Was it later in the process during clemency? Was it in did he have it back when he was a kid? But a lot of this you got to is very forward looking in terms of how long these legal proceedings go on, and you
Right.
may be fresh at the trial level with a client and getting an IQ test, and maybe you're going to need to record that just because you never know in 20 years from now when they're doing post conviction relief and they get another test, are you going to want something substantial to measure it against? Like I think in an ideal world you'd have these all well documented. But we don't live in an ideal world. So is it possible to just use the literature to sort of cast a shadow on any IQ testing based on inter-rater reliability?
If you go in totally blind, where you have nobody in the room, no video, and there's enough in the literature for anybody uh, to be criticized. It's really the onus is on the person giving the tests to establish that they've done it right. This
And of
graph
course the
shows
margin of error swings both ways, right? So they could be wrong to your detriment or wrong to your benefit.
right.
So
If
doesn't
it's
that
done
make the other
randomly,
factors?
yeah.
Yeah.
If it's done randomly, then it could be go either way. If the person has an agenda, it can very easily be slanted one way or the other.
So
So unfortunately, that's the fact.
you can cheat these tests. You can put your thumb on the scales when you're
Yeah,
administering these tests from a
yeah.
clinical perspective.
It's
Okay.
really critical too to get the raw data in a test. The interesting thing is that there are certain psychologists. This is mostly in medical that I've seen in medical malpractice and in personal injury that are the go-to by the people defending either the slumlord or the person who's really at fault. And it's the same person I always go to. And you see things in they're very reluctant to give up the raw data. But when they do, you pick up all kinds of things in the raw data that are not in the report, which is kind of an interesting psychological thing because they're willing to do that to lie in a report, but they don't lie in the raw data. Raw data is very, very useful.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something that if there's any question, any suspicion, should definitely get the raw
Get the
data.
raw data. It's great. Great practice pointer. Thank you. All right. What's next?
Okay, now this is just shows the effect of inter-rater reliability on the confidence limits. This is for an IQ of 75. Now, with a standard error of measurement of 3, this is right from the manual,
Mm-hmm.
and a inter-rater reliability of 0.975. This is the IQ of 75. This is the top of the range, which is about 82, 83, and the lower range is 70. If it drops just 0.95, right? In other words, 200ths of a percentage point, it drops the upper goes up to about 84, the lower goes down to about 66.
Mm-hmm.
If it drops us just a little bit more, say say it drops to not point 0.9, which is a very good inter-rater reliability, the lower is around 65.
Wow.
So and on and on and on.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
it's extremely important, and it's a very hard thing to get to measure. In the case in front of the Supreme Court, a lot was made of the standard error of measurement of being point three, being three, without any of these considerations. It's almost never three because the tests are given by normal people. It's not given by the examiners who had like 2 weeks of training to give the tests. It's given by somebody in the field.
Uh-huh.
People make mistakes.
To quote Homer Simpson, if you lived in a gumdrop house on Lollipop Lane, your rate would be 3, but that's not, nobody does. That's not real life.
Right.
And it seems to me though, so, which is interesting because the further down you go, the greater the gap is, but it can be very high. Again, it could be to your
Yeah.
detriment, very high. You could go up to, into the 80s, or you could go way down into the low 60s or maybe below. So it seems to me that makes these other factors, their true functioning, their adaptive functioning, all these, this sort of narrative, the place where I live and breathe about how do these people actually get along in the world, makes that so much more relevant, so that you can say the deviation has got to be down, more likely to be down on the downside than the upside, right?
Standardized testing can help in making decisions once you have the adaptive functioning data, but to base it on an IQ test, that being the critical factor, does a tremendous disservice to the person who's being tested. This paper that I'm quoting from here was published 2016 in Psychological Assessment. In their testing, they found that 73% of full-scale IQs are changed as a result of examiner errors. It's huge, huge number.
Say that
Uh,
again. 73% of
73% of full-scale IQ scores are changed as a result of examiner error. The
oh,
examiners were licensed psychologists and
wow.
graduate students with some training.
Wow. Yeah,
And
that's a
those are the
lot.
ones who give most of the tests.
Yeah.
Their conclusion was that current estimates for the standard error measurement of popular IQ tests may not adequately capture the variance due to the examiner.
Okay. And that's a published peer-reviewed study
Yeah,
that you could cite to in
right.
examining this. Well, this is all very depressing, doctor, because they place such a high premium on the number, the IQ.
Yeah,
That seems to be, even though there are other factors and it varies from state to state, that seems to be the driver. And you're basically saying the the driver is the car is run off the road.
right.
Yeah, this is not good. Okay.
Right. The last part, which won't make you any happier, is that IQs above 70, especially average IQs or higher, cannot be found in individuals with types of brain injury that reduce culpability. This is the belief that you have a normal IQ, then you're okay.
Yeah.
I bring up an interesting case from the history of neurology. There's a history of Phineas Gage, who is pictured at the left. You notice his left eye is closed. It's because
Hmm.
there's nothing behind that. Phineas Gage was a foreman who was they're laying down track, and he what they would do is they would pour down a hole, tamp down dynamite or some explosive to to I'm not sure why they would do that, but that's part of laying down track. At any rate, when they were tamping it down, apparently there was a spark, and the rod, which he's holding in his hand there,
Uh-huh.
shot up, went through his left eye, and this picture shows the path, and took out his frontal lobes.
Wow.
Amazingly, he survived, and his doctor described him in the following way. I think it's worth reading.
Uh-huh.
Uh, he remembers passing and past events correctly. Uh, see what's going on. As well as before, since the injury, intellectual manifestations, feeble. He became exceedingly capricious and childish, but with the will as indomitable as ever. He was particularly obstinate. He would not yield to restraint when it conflicts with his desires. Problems with impulse control. He
Yeah.
reports that Gage's employers who regarded him as most efficient and capable foreman before considered change in his mind so marked that wouldn't give him his place again. He is fitful, irreverent,
Reverend.
indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which was not his previous custom, manifesting but little deference for his fellows, impatient of restraint or advice, who conflicts with desires, a child's intellectual capacity and manifestations. He has the animal passions of a strong man. His mind was radically changed so decidedly that his friends and acquaintances said he's no longer Gage.
Wow.
That's what happens with frontal lobe damage.
Wow.
This
I might have
slide
some of that
shows.
because I engage in seriously gross profanity. I'm trying
Yeah,
to control it
yeah,
on the podcast though.
I
Anywho,
do. I do my
so
best.
yeah, so this guy's got a spike through his brain. Did they do IQ? Do we know about his IQ change?
This is before the IQ tests even were developed,
Oh,
but we do
okay.
know from the era of frontal lobotomies that you have these changes that are shown here: impaired executive functioning, poor judgment, problems in working memory, inattention, distractibility, problems with impulse control, apathy, disinhibition. That's in social situations as well. Tactlessness, emotional lability, irritability or aggression, impulsivity, perseveration, lack of insight, reduced empathy, socially inappropriate behavior, poor moral judgment, and minimally reduced or no change in IQ whatsoever.
So those are all the symptoms from a frontal lobotomy, but their
Right.
IQ is unchanged.
Yeah. And
That's
here's
so
just
interesting
one
because
more.
the only experience I have with frontal lobotomy is what from watching One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and the way they portray that is you're just zombified at that point. You can barely speak or move, so it's hard for again. And even though that's probably very different than the reality on the ground, we all are sort of accessing these comparison points because it's all we know. So we're thinking about these things, thinking about that all wrong too. Then you're saying you could have a frontal lobotomy and still do relatively well on an IQ test. I'm trying to figure out how to reconcile that with the image of Jack Nicholson drooling on himself in a bed.
In the era where they did those lobotomies, as he, which is what they were really talking about in that movie, they were called, usually it was something called an ice pick lobotomy, in which they literally use something like an ice pick. And they either give the person ECT, electrical convulsive shock, to make them to anesthetize it, or anesthesia. Generally, they use ECT, and they would drive a something like an ice pick up through the eye orbit into the frontal lobes and sort of swish it around and go from the other side. And sometimes people did wind up like what Jack Nicholson was portraying.
Oh,
So a lot of
goodness.
times they
Okay.
didn't, but they still were. They're no longer what they were before.
Okay.
Interesting thing too is the person who pioneered frontal lobotomy. His name is Moniz. Won a Nobel Prize for what he did.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, and speaking
But
about the
doesn't
frontal
that
lobes,
just isn't that just perfect though? Because it speaks to the larger problem, which is we only know what we know when we know it, and our understanding of all of these issues continues to evolve and progress, and we can look back on something and say we really got this seriously wrong. But that's the sad part of the system, especially in the criminal system, where we come to these understandings so slowly, and the damage that's done in the process of our ignorance is catastrophic. And it sounds
and,
like that's exactly what's happening in this context. I know it's
and that's
happening
this.
in the autism context.
I mean, that's the story of IQ. It has its uses, but that's not one of them. I just want to bring to your attention something related to frontal lobe damage, is traumatic brain injury, which is a neglected major risk factor for criminal behavior. It very, very frequently involves damage to the frontal lobes. As a result, there are changes of personality. They can be long lasting or permanent, and IQ is very often totally unaffected.
Hmm. Okay, and
So, how do you
we
assess?
see TBI in case after case after case in every
Uh,
kind of criminal case.
yeah, the
So,
actual the actual numbers of people who have been incarcerated who have suffered traumatic brain injury is staggering, and it's usually preceding what got them into preceding the criminal behavior.
yep,
I think for teenagers, it's something like 70%. It's a huge number.
yep.
there's I haven't got into it. It's an hour on its own on the literature on frontal lobe damage and in general empathy, connecting cause and effect, moral reasoning, social judgment, and criminality. There's a lot in the peer-reviewed literature.
Okay.
Never seems to make it to the legal end of things, but
Yeah.
it's not a small literature. It's big. At any rate, how do you assess culpability? How do you assess the behavioral effects of brain injury? This when I'm saying assessing culpability, I think the first thing that really needs to be done is looking at adaptive behavior, which is not something that you do with objective testing. There are other ways to do it, but to assess the behavioral effects of brain injury, something else is different type of testing is necessary. It's neuropsychological testing, which is objective, it's reliable, it's reference baseline. I don't want to go into it. This is a very big subject.
Yeah.
Neuropsychological functions you can assess fine motor functioning, attention, including impulse control, memory and learning. And here's the critical thing: executive functioning, concept formation, planning, abstract reasoning, judgment, empathy, moral reasoning. There are objective tests that can be applied. And interesting thing, generally, even when people do neuropsychs, they don't often test for social reasoning or empathy or judgment. It's not usually, but it can be included, and there are objective tests for it, and it should be included. And other more reasonable, more traditional tests of adaptive functioning, like the Vineland,
Yes.
and and it would take an experienced examiner to come to a conclusion that can be
Yeah.
defended.
And I will say in my autism cases, when we use true autism experts, the Vineland is almost always on the table,
Oh yeah,
and
it's
the
really
results are staggering. Where they I mean, they come out into 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 year old children in terms of their
right.
adaptive functioning, and so I always tell people with autism case, you got to get a Vineland. But
Yeah,
but
it's
it's
really
almost so shocking the results that people have a hard time believing those too. How do you have a college graduate that's functioning at the level of a 3 year old child? That's the disconnect is it's a chasm, Grand Canyon
yeah.
size.
But it happens. Yeah, the story of Temple Grandin. Are you familiar with her?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
She was a professor at I think University of Tennessee or Louisville,
Uh-huh.
and she was a very high functioning person with autism.
Yeah.
I mean, she described once she was with Alva Sachs, the clinical neurologist. Are you
Mm-hmm.
familiar with Alva Sachs?
Did he write the anthropologist on Mars? Did he author that book?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Also,
I read that, and I read because one of the chapters is on her.
yeah, the movement from this should be the movie Awakenings, where I
De
think Robert De
Niro.
Niro
Yeah,
plays.
yeah.
Yeah,
And Robin
yeah,
Williams.
that was a chapter from one of Oliver Sacks's compendiums. At any rate, he went to visit her. They were walking in the field, and he commented, "It's just a beautiful sunset." And she said, "I can understand the colors are very, very distinct, but I don't understand what you mean by beautiful. I don't understand what that means."
Hmm.
And that it's she has perfect cognitive functioning, but the emotional, and
Mm-hmm.
that's the deficit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right. So, in conclusions, full scale IQ is often not a valid proxy for overall cognitive functioning. Brain injury can cause profound changes in behavior without major effects on IQ at all. IQ tests should not be used to assess the effects of brain injury. Traumatic brain injury, particularly that involving the frontal lobes, cause behavioral changes that directly affect culpability without significantly affecting IQ. And finally, neuropsychological tests should always be used to evaluate individuals with the same brain injury. I should say one interesting, it's the bottom line. Only low IQ scores are a valid proxy for reduced culpability. Not it's not a good litmus test. And in contrast, an individual who has sustained a brain injury, full-scale IQ scores that are greater than 70 do not rule out the possibility the neurocognitive functions critical of culpability have been impaired. And just for let's include this one thing, interesting case. This is a 51-year-old man who was serving a prison sentence for car theft. At the age of 33, he had a subarachnoid hemorrhage due to a ruptured aneurysm of the anterior communicating artery that led to what you see here. This is from a CAT scan. This is a slice. You're looking down from the top of the brain. So this is the frontal lobes. Frontal lobes here. There's the back of the brain here. This hole is a hole in his frontal lobe. Okay, so he's sustained that. Up before this happened, he had no medical psychiatric history. Had never been in trouble. He was married, he had a daughter. He had been working for 10 years as a test driver in a car factory.
Mm.
Skip ahead. After the aneurysm ruptured, he recovered, slowly recovered. He was discharged from the hospital a month later, apparently well. A few weeks later, he took one of the cars, which were routinely kept with keys in the ignition, drove it home, and parked it close by. And he repeated this behavior several times for the next few weeks, accumulating borrowed cars in the vicinity of his house. Although he was well aware that this was illegal, borrowing cars, as he called it, gave him a kind of pleasurable relief. He never tried to sell the cars. He didn't even try to hide them. He simply abandoned them in isolated places. He estimated that over the years he had borrowed close to 100 cars. Since his hemorrhage, he had become incapable of holding a job for more than a few weeks and so on.
Mm.
His IQ, the selected tests of the IQ, whole IQ wasn't given, but they were entirely normal. So this is what frontal lobe damage can do.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow. You know, the
Yeah.
sad thing is, I think about the capital cases, and they go back, the government goes back, and they point out every time a client's done something wrong, got in trouble from school, got suspended from school, brought a weapon to school, got in fights, got juvenile, in trouble with the juvenile system and everything else. And their narrative is always the same one, which is they're bad seed, they've been bad since they were born. And and the truth is, these are the kids that probably have fine IQs, but these are all probably pointing to executive function and all these other deficits that we've been talking about for the last hour. So I think my takeaway, and maybe I'm biased because I'm the story guy, but you've got to tell the story of the true deficits that the IQ will never tell. And I also think about my cousin Vinny, because I'm thinking about the oral argument, if that hasn't already happened in the Supreme Court for this Smith case that they're going to talk about IQ. And I don't know if you remember Joe Pesci's opening statement. It was, everything that guy said is bullshit. That's it. Like, just
Yeah,
say
yeah,
that and sit down. I mean, but really, the takeaway is
yeah.
we need people like you to, when we have these cases, capital or not, we need very, very qualified professionals, not only to do testing the right way, but to explain what all this stuff really means for people like me and the prosecutor and the judge and the jurors who don't know any of this. Why would we? And we've made all these assumptions, and we can never let those assumptions stand when it comes to representing our clients. So, that if you're not watching this, you're listening to it. There's a slide here with Dr. Lidsky's contact information. Ted Lidsky, PhD, 732-580-6157. T Lidsky, TLIDSKY @gmail.com. But of course, I will put his contact information and everything in the show notes to this episode. He could be a valuable asset in your case. He might even save a life. Who knows? But I really want to thank you for doing this, Dr. Lidsky. I cannot believe how much there is to know about this stuff that so many people don't know. So you've made us all a little bit smarter, and hopefully it catches fire.
Hope so. Okay, thank you.
That's it for today, but before we go, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you to you, the listener, for spending time with us today getting set for sentencing. Whether you're a lawyer, someone who could use the help, or maybe you're just a true crime buff who loves the inside scoop on how this whole thing works, if you're interested in knowing more about what I do, mitigation videos, case consults, live teaching, on-demand educational content, books, articles, all of it, please visit www.dougpassonlaw.com. I'm Doug Passon. Until next time, hang in there. Wait a minute, that's a stupid way to sign off on a podcast about sentencing. Hang in there. What's the matter with you, man? I guess they call that gallows humor. Sorry. All right. Well, I will see you next time on Set for Sentencing. Bye-bye.